The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913 to create what became known as the Federal Reserve. So, what is the Federal Reserve? So now it is commonly known as the Central Bank of the United States, but contrary to its name, the Federal Reserve is neither federal nor does it have any actual money, nor does it have any reserves whatsoever. In fact, the Federal Reserve can be more described as a privately owned bank in a sense. So what does it do? So how does the Federal Reserve, destroy our economy? First of all, it steals from us by causing inflation. So the Federal Reserve? It is the institution that determines our money supply by injecting or taking money out of the economy. And how does it inject money into the money supply? By through buying assets. And how does it take money? By selling them. So, through buying and selling assets in the open market operations, the Federal Reserve controls our money supply. So, how does the Federal Reserve benefit banks? Because in reality, despite all its name and its popularity and the fact that most Americans are ignorant of it, the Federal Reserve is just a money laundering scheme by the banks. So here's what the Federal Reserve does. First of all, most banks have a reserve requirement of 10%. That is to say that 10% of its money must be kept in reserves backed by cash, and the other 90% is lent out. For example, let's say I deposit $100 into the bank, into my account. So only 10 of them will be kept backed up by cash, and the other 90 will be loaned out. And at some point, the $90 that gets loaned out will be cashed and will be deposited, and out of that 10% will be kept in reserve and 90% will be lent out, and which means $81 will be lent out, and so on and so forth. And the next time when the $81 gets cashed and deposited, $72 will be lent out, and this process continues to the point where eventually the money supply multiplies by 10, and you end up creating 10 times more money than original. So of course 10 times 100 is 1,000, so you end up creating $1,000. The worst is that this is what it's known as the fractional reserve banking system, and this is what causes the money supply to multiply exponentially, all while benefiting the banks. And what the banks are doing is that they lent out money they created through thin air and charge an interest rate. Think about it. This is a lazy, slothful scheme by the banks. This is a lazy, slothful scheme by the banks when they lend out money that they never had to begin with, that they just create out of thin air through clicking their fingers. And how does the Federal Reserve create money? By writing a check on itself and buying whatever asset it wants. And the money ends up going to a bank, and then, as I said, 10% of it typically gets kept, the other 90% gets lent out. And I only gave you an easy example of $100. Imagine just how much worse it will be with larger amounts of money. And so when banks lent out money that they never had in the first place, they create out of thin air and charge at an interest rate, that's to say you have to pay in order to lend it, it is doubly wicked, because the Bible forbids charging interest. The Bible teaches in Nehemiah chapter 5 that even charging 1% interest is called usury. And this is something that most Christians do not understand. So another way how the Federal Reserve bankrupts our economy here is this: through the boom bust cycles. So what the Federal Reserve does is that it controls the interest rates. And when it wants to lower the interest rates, it injects money into the economy. And through injecting money into the economy, through buying up assets, interest rates naturally become lower, and they become lower. And this is what is known as easy money. And this is what generates something known as a boom. Have you ever heard of the boom bust cycle? Here's how a boom is generated. A boom is generated when the Federal Reserve injects money into the economy through buying up assets, left, right, and center, injecting money into the economy, thereby lowering interest rates. And what do lower interest rates do? They stimulate investment. People are tempted to make investments. They may just make big purchases such as housing. They just make big purchases such as cars. And if you've ever bought extremely expensive items such as a house or a car, these are extremely expensive assets. What you do is that oftentimes you take on a loan, right? And when interest rates are low, this is what tempts people to make investments, right? And here's the problem. When the interest rates get hiked up, get hiked up, which inevitably does, what happens? The bust happens. Why is this the bust happens? It's because there are many activities, many investments which are built upon low interest rates, which depend on low interest rates, which can only survive and are only affordable to their investors on low interest rates. They suddenly become unaffordable. They suddenly become unrealistic, unaffordable. For example, take for example the mortgages. Let's say you take out the adjustable rate mortgages. Let's say you take out a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage for a home that you bought, right? But here's the thing. When you buy that home, right? When you're on mortgage, right? When you buy the home with money that you borrowed, that home technically doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the bank. And should you default on your loans, should you fail to make those loan payments, the bank can come and seize your home anytime. And so here's what happens. Here's how the banks steal your property, steal your money, steal your property and your assets. Let's say you take out a loan that you at a low interest rate during a time of low interest rates to make an investment, such as buying a house or buying a car, right? And while you're paying it off, right, suddenly the interest rates get jacked up again, which suddenly makes it much more expensive, much less affordable. And this is beyond your income bracket, beyond your means to pay back. So what happens then? The activities which depended on low interest rates, they go bust. They collapse. The activities which could only exist thanks to low interest rates, they go bust. And this is what causes a recession. A recession is simply a corrective mechanism for these faulty investments. So how do banks benefit in the process? Well, here's the thing. As we talked about earlier on, if you cannot pay off the loan, if you default on your loan for something that what happens? The bank will seize your assets. Let's say I borrow money to pay for my house, right? To buy a house, and I'm in the process of paying it off when suddenly I can't pay it off anymore. I have default on the loan. What happens? The bank comes in, they take my house, or they can take my car. And this is how they end up gaining these assets. So what happens through this boom-bust cycle when they lower interest rates? When they lower interest rates, this tempts people to make investments. This tempts people to make investments in projects, and these investors just buy a house and buy a car. And in these times of low interest rates, all these investments seem to be affordable and realistic, right? It causes a temporary boom. However, a lot of these investments are faulty. They're based on fault. They're faulty. Are wrong decisions. Because why? Because they're only affordable thanks to a low interest rate. Should the interest rates get jacked up, which they inevitably will, a lot of them just go bust, and a lot of jobs that were just artificially created during the boom process just collapse as the projects collapse, and a lot of the investments that you make, such as on your house and your car, they go bust, and what happens? You lose those houses. And what happens? You become homeless, you lose your home to foreclosure, you lose your car, you lose your big assets, and what happens? Who takes your property? The bank. And this is how the entire fraudulent Federal Reserve System does. It destroys your savings through inflation, which renders your savings worthless over time. Number one. Number two is that it steals your property. It fools you through lowering interest rates, which to stimulate investment, to make certain investments seem appealing, which they hadn't been before. But then, as interest rates get jacked up, the investments that depended on low interest rates suddenly go belly up. People are no longer able to pay their mortgages. They're unable to pay their loans. They're unable to pay whatever costs, and then whatever jobs, whatever investments that were created by the boom go bust. And what happens? People lose property. People lose houses, and what do the banks gain? The banks, they gain everything. And this is how a system of Federal Reserve tyranny